Hello. I am talking about a church today which I am not overly familiar with, but I have researched, and I find it to be quite interesting, and that is the Methodist Church. Now, the Methodist Church was founded by a man by the name of John Wesley, and he went to the colony of Georgia, which at the time was a penal colony. And upon his return to England, he was a missionary for the Church of England at the time. And when he got back to England, he ended up having a little bit of a revelation. And he ended up founding the Methodist Church there. And there are a few things that are quite interesting about the early Methodist Church. One of the big things is their reliance on lay ministers, especially when you look at early Methodist churches in America starting in really the 1760s. And you had men who were farmers, uh, whatever, generally farmers. It was the early Americans. But they were preachers on Sunday and they worked their farm or whatever they had the rest of the week. And they were not ordained. They could not give sacraments. They could not do that. But they spread the church. And they did something interesting for the time, and that was they preached to anybody. They didn't care. And what I mean by that is they preached to whites, upper class, middle class, lower class, didn't matter. Rich, poor, or somewhere in between. They'd preach to Indians if they'd listen. And they preached to slaves. They preached to free blacks, free black men and women. It didn't matter to them. They were going to preach and they were going to give the word of salvation. Now, they ran into some pretty serious trouble around the time of the Revolution. They were still a relatively young denomination, particularly in the Americas. And the trouble they ran into was they were viewed as a loyalist church. You had some lay ministers who refused to fight the British, who refused to back the rebellion. Being disloyal at the time was not necessarily good for someone's health, but they were looked upon negatively because of that. But they managed to get through it, and as you see today, they're a very influential denomination. But they went ahead, they pushed through, and they would welcome immigrants. They didn't care. Over the years, they continued preaching to slaves. Their influence spread. They spread all over the country. You had northern churches, you had southern churches who officially believed the same thing, but there were some differences in the northern and southern churches that you're just going to have, particularly at that time due to the different environments. What's appropriate for a church in Maine may not be appropriate for a church in Georgia. It's just kind of the way it is, local lifestyles, things like that. But in particular, what I'm talking about there is slavery. The South was pretty heavily invested in slavery, and you couldn't exactly have a religion spread in the South that was vehemently anti-slavery at the time. But there were denominations, there were churches who, to be a member of that church, you either had to not own a slave or you had to agree to free said slave in a certain amount of time. There were a bunch of requirements about how much time, when it had to happen. It was all based on age and a few other things. It's too complicated to get into here. But it's really an interesting denomination. They have had a lot of influence over the years, and they're really an interesting denomination to study.